This podcast is brought to you by the IIEA, sharing ideas, shaping policy.
Just to introduce our chair very briefly, I think anyone who follows our work will know Professor Keaveney now. Professor Keaveney, Karen Keaveney is at the School of Agriculture and Food at UCD, one of my analysts. Great to have you, Karen. Karen leads the Citizen Rural Research Lab at the school, is a founding member of UCD's Centre for Irish Towns, and holds a major Irish Research Council grant looking at, if I'm not mistaken, decision-making in rural communities, but looking at data.
Yes.
Cool, great topic. And just most importantly, Karen is a leading thinker in Ireland and indeed in Europe on the matters under discussion. So most sincere thanks to our speaker and indeed to your team for organising, and to you, Karen, and I'll hand over to you now.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Thanks for the welcome. So you're all most welcome today to the IIEA, where we are very pleased to be joined by Simon Upton, New Zealand's Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment. And thank you so much, Simon, for being so generous with your time and joining us today. Mr. Upton will speak for us for around 20 minutes or so. I know he said he has a lot of slides. And then we will go to Q&A with our audience, both here in person and online. To those in the room, should you wish to ask a question, please raise your hand, and well, we won't be bringing a microphone.
Just shout.
We will shout at the owls here, but also to those online, you'll be able to join the discussion through Q&A function on Zoom, which you should see on your screen. For those asking questions either online or in person, please remember to include your name and association when doing so. And a reminder that today's presentation and Q&A are both on the record. So I will now formally introduce Mr. Upton and then hand over to him. Simon Upton was sworn in as Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment for a 5-year term on the 16th of October 2017. He is now in his second 5-year term. Simon is a Fellow of the Royal Society of New Zealand and a Rhodes Scholar with degrees in English Literature, Music and Law from the University of Auckland and an MLit in Political Philosophy from Oxford University. He was sworn in as a member of the Privy Council in 1999. A Member of Parliament between 1981 and 2000, Mr. Upton held a variety of ministerial portfolios, including environment, research, biosecurity, health and state services between 1990 and 1999. After leaving Parliament, Mr. Upton moved to Paris to chair the Round Table on Sustainable Development at the OECD. In 2005, he returned to New Zealand to pursue a number of private sector roles while continuing to chair the Round Table. In April 2010, he returned to the OECD full-time as Environment Director, a post he held for 7 years until returning to take up his current role. So thank you so much, and I'll hand over to you now.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. Let me first explain, if you don't mind, I'm going to look this way because that's where the slide's going to be, and anyhow, they will be more appealing to look at than me. So, okay, let me just explain my role as Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment. It is, as far as I know, a unique role. No other country has one. I don't work for the government and I'm not subject to ministerial direction. So rather, my role is to assist the Parliament in scrutinising the operation of the environmental management system in New Zealand. We're now 38 years into the life of the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment's Office. And as I keep saying to people, either this is still a harbinger of the future or I am an evolutionary dead end, because no other country has decided that it's an office that they want to create. Because I don't report to ministers and am not tasked with implementing their political priorities, I can examine environmental issues in depth and canvass solutions that officials, if I should put it this way, lack the mandate, time or resources to consider. Now, to the topic in hand, land use change and its intersection with climate policy. Now, look, this is a fairly dense address. I'm going to read it because I want to be very precise about the language that I use. We're broadcasting it. I must say, put on record what I've carefully prepared. You need to watch the slides. There are a lot of clicks in this. You won't be able to take it all in, but the whole idea was to put a large bundle of material together, which you can then use and reflect on should you wish to. I don't need to explain to an audience in this country, or any country, I hope, that the positions countries carry into international negotiations are properly rooted in their domestic context and interests. So for New Zealand, agriculture and forestry are key sectors. And I'd like to share with you my take on why New Zealand approaches climate policy the way that it does. And it starts with the way we use and have used our land. So here's a very brief overview. The history of humans in New Zealand's landscapes can be broadly described as passing through three transformational phases: deforestation, pastoralisation, and intensification. Now, as these three maps show, deforestation began with the arrival of Polynesian settlers, left-hand map, and was rapidly accelerated by European settlements. Sorry, left-hand maps before any humans. Sorry, left-hand maps before any humans. Arrival of Polynesians, middle map, arrival of Europeans reflected in the third one. Sector pastoralism was driven by consumers on this side of the planet. By 1983, there were 70 million sheep and still only about 3 million humans. Subsidies introduced to support agriculture ended up seriously distorting land use. Their removal in the mid-1980s led to another convulsion in our landscapes. Sheep numbers have today fallen to around 20 million. By contrast, the number of dairy cows has risen from 3.4 million in 1990 to 5.9 million in 2023, bringing with it a significant intensification of land use. This phase of intensification and diversification into things like deer, horticulture, viticulture continues to this day. Plantation forestry has also become a major land use. New Zealand recognised early on that continued logging of slow-growing native timbers, which you saw in the photo before, would far outstrip demand. So the search was on for a fast-growing exotic species. Pinus radiata from California was selected as the most promising candidate, and market demand led to mass plantings in the 1920s and again in the 1990s, and accelerated further when forest units were included without limitation as an acceptable offset in our emissions trading scheme. More on that later. It's a very important point, but I'll come back to it. My little history lesson illustrates a key insight about land use in New Zealand. In the absence of subsidies, and we did have a big spell of subsidies in the 1970s, 80s, but in the absence of subsidies, land use is highly dynamic in its response to market signals. This slide shows the net land use change in New Zealand between just 1996 and 2018. Over that period, roughly 300,000 hectares saw its land cover change. That's just under 2% of New Zealand's land area, excluding protected areas like national parks. It's not large, but it's not insignificant either. The nature of the changes is complex. Forests and beef and sheep land have been transitioning to dairy. Okay, so that's dairying on the right, and these are the land uses on the left, which have been swallowed into dairy. At the same time, agricultural land use has become forested. That was initially driven by the economics of timber, but more recently it's been supercharged by our emissions trading scheme. Now, without substantive changes to New Zealand's climate policy, we will see a new phase of transformation, fossil emitter-driven afforestation. Now, I've been investigating land use change and its intersection with climate change policy since 2019. In fact, I've been thinking about it for much longer. I was the Minister for the Environment when the whole Framework Convention was put together and was there at Kyoto in 1997. And I'm one of the guilty people for having started New Zealand down the road that it's on. But when I came back from the OECD, one of the first things I did was set about commissioning some modelling to understand the implications of the government's climate change policies on the New Zealand landscape. This modelling estimated that the scale of land use change that would be expected to occur at the national level if all emissions were priced equally, including those from agriculture, and if emitters were allowed unlimited access to forestry offsets through our ETS. And the modelling indicated, if you just give open-ended access to forestry, that we would have a massive conversion of land to forestry. Up to 5.4 million hectares of current farmland would change to forestry by 2075. Now, that's a model, okay? The exercise was relatively crude and it suffered from a number of limitations. Importantly, the impacts of other environmental policies, such as fresh water quality regulations, were not considered. So, from the point of view of both farmers and environmentalists, it's actually the combined impact, both financially and environmentally, that mattered. It's all of the environmental regulations, not just climate. But what it revealed to me was that New Zealand needed to take a landscape-based approach to managing climate and other environmental challenges, by which I mean integrating everything we knew about land uses and environmental processes at the landscape scale and marrying that with bottom-up grassroots knowledge. And I tested my new idea by using some more fine-grained catchment-specific modelling tools alongside talking to local communities. And the modelling considered how climate policies would affect land use change and how the interaction between different environmental policies targeting agricultural emissions, water quality, and biodiversity might work together or not work together. I undertook 2 case studies in very different parts of New Zealand, 2 different catchments, one in the far south of the country and one in the far north. These are separated by 1,750 kilometres. We tested 6 hypothetical policy scenarios to estimate the resulting environmental and economic outcomes. And the policies we were including in the modelling were freshwater regulations, biodiversity regulations, farm levies on greenhouse gas emissions, and the use of forestry offsets in the ETS, offsets for fossil emissions. And he held lots of workshops to make sure that we weren't making completely arcane judgments just from a modelling point of view, but trying to ground truth that against the way that people who had money invested in the game felt about it. And what the modelling delivered was really striking. And this is the northern one of the 2 catchments. Current and planned climate and environmental policy settings would have seen sheep and beef farming transformed to pine forests as a function of relative profitability by 2060. Forestry is green on the map. So you can see one industry completely vanishes. And only dairying in the most productive areas could afford to keep going. Says he's staring, purple is dairying, and it hangs on. It hangs on, although it becomes less profitable. The scenarios based on alternative policy mixes then recycled revenue from the methane levies, which the government of the day was talking about, to help pay for some of the other environmental outcomes. The results were less extreme, but still very challenging. And here's what the projected outcome for that same area looked like. So there's the base case on the left-hand side, and then 6 different scenarios, which there were different ideas about how you recycle money and different regulatory standards. But you can still see across most of them a very, very significant change. The same thing happened down in the southern catchment. It was a bit different. Of course, it's a different climate. It's probably much more profitable and productive land down there. So they weren't identical, but the broad thrust was the same. Now, the reason I've just taken you through this is that we did this really very fine-grained, hopelessly overambitious, I think, modelling exercise to prove what to demonstrate that our intuitions were not unfounded, that you would see massive land use change if you simply had policy on autopilot which weren't talking to one another. And rather than publish these 2 studies just by themselves, I thought people are going to say reasonably, yeah, okay, but you know, they're just studies about individual places, everywhere's different, and then people would start picking into the modelling and why the modelling was inadequate, and you know, you shouldn't have done this. So what lessons do you think? And we talked to the communities a great deal, actually. What lessons would you learn from a study like this that you might be able to extrapolate nationally? And we came up with four key messages. Well, the first key lesson from these case studies, though, was that to achieve a broad range of environmental goals, you really need to balance environmental policies and create a mix of land uses, because if we don't, we only focus on climate, then the rest of the environment's going to suffer. The second lesson was that the current national policy trajectory was likely to have significantly different outcomes depending on the context of the catchment and the farm systems located there. It's one of the reasons I didn't want to publish these alone, because everything is dependent on the context. But the learning is a one-size-fits-all policy approach won't work. So I extracted from that what I call four critical problems for policymakers and land users that they couldn't ignore. So that was the way I decided to frame it, to say, listen, whatever you think about this, there are four conclusions I don't think you can avoid. The first, to meet our environmental goals, the way we use land must change. And that's one of my non-negotiables. Some parts of New Zealand face multiple challenges that cannot be solved by better management. Research undertaken by a major government-sponsored science challenge, you can see the results up there, suggests that in roughly 1/3 of catchments, environmental bottom lines are being exceeded beyond levels that can be mitigated for either nitrogen, phosphorus, or sediment. The modelling actually had a fourth one, which is E. coli, but the data was simply not good enough to really support the conclusion. So we just held it to that. So the three in the Venn diagram there, you've got nitrogen, sediment, phosphorus, and then in 1.5%, it's the dark colour in the middle of catchments, all three contaminants are beyond limits that you could manage back to the limit. And that is before we add pressure on biodiversity, for example, ongoing loss of wetlands. So that's another environmental stressor which is not picked up by that. So that's the first message. The way we use land has to change, at least in some places. The second critical problem is that climate change is already redealing the cards in a way that will place some existing land uses at risk. The catastrophic consequences of Cyclone Gabrielle in northeastern New Zealand in 2023 removed any doubts about the continuing viability of both production, forestry, and farming in certain locations. Just watch the slide because it moves from one picture to another, but these are the two sides of the way forestry and pastoral farming were hit by that cyclone. That had been recently harvested forest, and the non-foresty bit there was farmland until before the cyclone. So you can see the way I describe this in New Zealand, I put the first one up and I say, this is the slide you put up if you want to bag the forestry industry. And then this is the slide you put up if you want to bag the pastoral sector, because forestry comes out as the good guy. And this one, it's the one bit of the hill that's sort of held on in that picture. So that's the second message. Climate change is redealing the cards. You won't recognize that topography in Ireland. It's very young geology, it's on the move. So this is a very different place from Ireland, but it's something that we have to live with, and climate change is going to cause huge damage. Third, New Zealand has a very complex and fragmented policy landscape that's evolved over the last 20 years. Actually, I'll distract you. It's not really that one. We have a very complex, fragmented policy landscape that's evolved, and the environmental impacts of land use have been treated as a series of technical problems, needing discrete solutions that ignore the reality that landscapes are complex, interconnected systems with all sorts of feedback loops. A labyrinth of policies and funding mechanisms haven't helped either. You need a map to find your way around the government's various support mechanisms. Finally, New Zealand has tried to manage land use at the property level, which is not a good match for environmental issues, as this map shows. This is from the northern one of these two catchments, and the black lines are the property boundaries, the cadastral lines, and the colour is the susceptibility of land to E. coli contamination. This is based on modelling that we did. And you can see immediately that if you happen to own one of these parcels of land, it may or may not be susceptible, but guess what? what comes onto your land or leaves your land, something you've got no control over. So you've got a landscape, but if your management unit is property boundaries, you are in some difficulty. So how could decision makers do a better job? So we had 4 problems we said you can't run away from. Okay, we can do things in 4s. How can decision makers do a better job? I've recommended that we tackle all the environmental pressures imposed by rural land use in a joined up way at the most practical scale, which for me is the catchment or the sub-catchment. So I propose 3 ways forward. Firstly, bringing decision making closer to people who have to make significant land management changes or land use changes. Central and regional levels of government should agree on the desired environmental goals and outcomes with local communities, possibly through catchment management groups, deciding how to meet those goals. So you set your goals at a national level, regional level, but actually how you implement them, that might be better made the challenge which you hand to the people who are actually down there. And catchment groups are something which are starting to really take off in New Zealand. Secondly, investing in providing accessible, high quality information as a public good to land users and regulators. Easily said, but we make a hash of it. I can come back if you're interested. Thirdly, I think this is critical, being upfront about the cost and who will pay. Too often, environmental policies are proposed without clarity about who pays. I mean, is it going to be the landowner? Is it going to be public subsidies? Or will we just decide that the environment pays? But I think we need to be explicit about this and not let people say aspirationally they're doing things, hand the problem to somebody else to regulate it, hand the costs on, but then it's too hard to the farmer, so the environment ends up paying. But there is one issue that must be dealt with at the national level, and that's the environmental impacts of climate emissions, because, particularly with respect to methane, they are not place-based. An ETS or a tax is the way to go, in my view. Now, New Zealand's had an ETS for about 15 years, but from the outset, agriculture was excluded. But the decision to include almost unlimited forestry in the scheme has driven dramatic place-based consequences in rural New Zealand. So the ETS has become the principal driver of land use change in my country. And the government's recently introduced legislation trying to limit the types of rural land that can be used for carbon forestry, but I don't believe that's going to be adequate to stem the tide. Now, I remarked earlier that any country's climate policy is influenced by its national circumstances. So what are New Zealand's national circumstances? Well, our emissions profile is dominated, as you can see, by 2 things: agriculture and transport. We're one of these lucky countries that is 85% renewable for electricity, and we should be able to get to 100. Agricultural emissions account for over 50% of our total emissions. That's the highest portion of any OECD country. You come in a distant second at 34%. Learning more about your agricultural and climate policies is the principal reason I came at Frank's suggestion to Dublin. In New Zealand, afforestation has been latched onto as a cheap, easy way for us to achieve our climate goals. That was a sheep and cattle farm until recently. You can still see the yards are still there. This has further reinforced the dominance of radiata pine, which offers high carbon returns through its rapid carbon sequestration rates. The strategy comes with significant risks. These carbon forests must be effectively permanent to offset carbon emissions, which remain in the atmosphere for centuries. But that simply can't be guaranteed, given the increased threats from fire, disease, and extreme weather events that climate change is bringing in its wake. Leaving aside the fact that we don't have many institutions for managing things over hundreds and hundreds of years, do we? And if we continue to emit carbon dioxide and fail to reduce gross emissions, well, we'll need to plant more and more forests. Future generations will face the cost of maintaining a much larger forestry estate in a warming world. I think that's very risky. Furthermore, recent modelling has shown that a glut of forestry units entering the market a decade or so from now will cause the price to drop. and place the long-term viability of the entire emissions trading scheme at risk. Current arrangements simply cannot hold. That's the price, the carbon price in New Zealand, and you can see it heading south from the 2030s onwards, and that is the supply of forestry units pushing into the market. In my view, forestry should be removed from the NZ ETS. It would leave us with a simpler fossil fuel only ETS, which would drive carbon prices up and gross emissions down, just as an ETS is supposed to do. It would also remove artificial and substantial land use pressure. But what about agricultural emissions? Now, unsurprisingly, farmers have strenuously opposed any suggestion that they should be included in the ETS. Governments, on the other hand, know that they can't ignore such a large fraction of our emissions, over 50%. The current government's policy is still to put a price on methane by 2030. How that will work, no one yet knows. But while methane emissions may be all the same, the profitability of farms is not. So as the change in stock numbers I quoted shows, dairying is strongly profitable, while sheep farming in particular is margin. The contribution of sheep to methane emissions has plummeted. Dairying has replaced it. There you are. So the green bit rising is dairying, sheep is shrinking, and the top line's the total is beef cattle in there as well. So one sector has reduced its emissions and the other has simply swiped the atmospheric space they represent. So you can see immediately why a sheep farmer in New Zealand doesn't feel that he's the cause of the problem. He's actually reduced his emissions very significantly. This brings us to the truly thorny topic of what risks methane poses and what level of emissions reduction is required. Now, on this, New Zealand is in the middle of a largely well-informed and I think quite sophisticated debate about the treatment of different gases. As you know, methane and carbon dioxide have very different warming effects. Methane's a very potent warmer in the short term, but breaks down quickly in the atmosphere. We do not need to reduce methane emissions to zero to control warming. We simply need to control the flow of it. By contrast, and this is what happens. This is the temperature response with methane. So if you keep pulsing each year over a period of time, it's like turning the switch on the radiator, on the heater up. For whatever level you move to, you eventually reach a new temperature plateau caused by that flow of pollution. By contrast, each ton of carbon dioxide contributes much less to warming in the short term, but because it's long-lived in the atmosphere, it continues to warm the planet for thousands of years. So continuing to emit carbon dioxide cumulatively adds to warming. And that line goes on forever, whereas the methane one flattens out. So this differential warming effect led New Zealand to adopt a split gas domestic emissions reduction target. So carbon dioxide emissions need to go to net zero by 2050, while methane emissions need to be cut by between 24 and 47% by 2050. By the way, just to make the point, obviously under the UNFCCC, New Zealand reports and CO2 equivalent. I mean, it's just a conversion, you come up with a number, but for domestic purposes, we have a split gas target. I personally come to the view that we were all wrong back in the early 1990s. We should have had separate targets for separate gases. They represent quite different things for all sorts of reasons. And I think that this is a good policy of having these two different targets. I think it makes sense scientifically. I think it's more transparent and it opens up some innovative opportunities for farmers to contribute to addressing climate change in a way that is economically affordable. But it raises the question of what level of warming from methane we can live with. To prevent additional warming from CO2, we know we have to go to zero. To go to no additional warming from methane, it's just a question of stabilizing the flow, which some farmers believe doing nothing more than they're doing now. And there is quite a push in New Zealand to say, well, look, no additional warming. And look at the fossil, they're just adding it every year. We're at a plateau, or we're approaching a plateau. Well, unfortunately, it's not quite that simple. We've done a lot of work on this in the New Zealand context. This figure shows New Zealand's contribution to warming from all gases since 1850. As you can see, methane's contribution to warming far exceeds that of carbon dioxide. If we stopped emitting any greenhouse gases today, this is the warming that is locked in. If we continue on with business as usual, adopting low emissions technologies as they become economic, then this is the trajectory of future emissions. In New Zealand, farmers are arguing about no additional warming for agriculture. The exact reduction needed to achieve that depends on global action to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. That's for atmospheric chemistry reasons. But a central estimate is that a 14 to 15% reduction would likely be needed to ensure no additional warming by 2050. That's somewhere between the two top blue lines. Am I going to get another? Do I have to click that twice, or is that it?
That's it.
That's it, yes. This is a very complicated stat graph, but you can see if we were to go to 47% below the hashed line, that hashed blue area, then you would be making some progress. But even no additional warming doesn't carry you you have to do something to get no additional warming. How much New Zealand reduces warming from methane is both a domestic political question and one that will have to be defended in international negotiations. Sorry, I just wanted to check that there wasn't another line on that. I'm not looking at these every day. But anyhow, we're very welcome to come back to this. Now, you've heard me say that forest offsetting is not a defensible way of dealing with fossil carbon emissions, but it might be a way to mitigate some of the warming effects of agricultural methane emissions. So I have suggested that we should set up a separate ETS to manage biogenic methane that allows for forestry offsets. When I first suggested this idea, people thought I had completely lost the plot because trees absorb carbon dioxide, not methane. But this is where taking a warming perspective, I think, becomes important, because by absorbing carbon dioxide, trees effectively cool the planet, and that cooling remains only as long as the trees remain. Now, that's why it's not a safe offset for carbon dioxide, because the carbon dioxide is there forever. How do you get the trees to be there forever? But there is a commensurability between the warming effect over time of methane emissions from a herd of livestock and the cooling effects of a fixed area of pine production forest. And there you can see it. So the warming from a herd mirrored by the average cooling, and this is using temperature as the measure, that there is a plausible, it's not exact, but there's a plausible offset there. It turns out that the average harvest age of pine plantation, which is 28 years in New Zealand, it's a good match for the atmospheric life of biogenic methane. Now, the beauty of offsetting biogenic methane with trees is that the forest only has to remain as long as the flow of methane exists. If the herd of livestock were to decrease in size or emit less methane, the area of forest could be reduced. And because the warming is offset within a harvest cycle of radii of pine, that forest can be used for timber production as long as it is replanted. Now, we've commissioned some research on the amount of pine forest needed to mitigate the methane produced by different animals, and this is what the research produced. This is done by Professor Dave Frame, Dr. Nathaniel Melia. It's been internationally peer-reviewed. We're reasonably confident that this is certainly ballpark useful. And you can see if you've got a dairy cow, you need to plant 0.6 of a hectare. And if you've got a sheep, then you need 0.08 hectares. You can imagine in a country where you're getting more and more country covered with pine trees because you're offsetting this permanent thing called CO2, what you've done is given up the option value on that land forever, which is, from an economic point of view, a truly astonishing thing to have done. For the short-term wish not to reduce emissions, you've decided to park the pollution on the landscape, permanently lost your option value. That's not the case with agriculture. So if you do plant to offset, You can, if you did remove your livestock, you can then get the option value back because you can harvest the trees. So the current intersection of environmental policies as they affect land use is one that's seen climate policy driving land use change in a way that is, in my view, not socially or politically sustainable. And governments are now finding this increasingly contentious. But it doesn't have to be that way. If we were to stop using forestry as a get out of jail free card for our fossil emissions and confront the need for real emissions reductions, we open the way to afforestation as a sensible way of handling both water and soil issues and methane from livestock. Allowing farmers to offset some of their emissions with trees, and it doesn't have to be on their own land, it could be anywhere, could enable them to deliver additional reductions in warming on top of any that vaccines, feed additives, or genetics may deliver. And both of our countries are working busily on the technical side. So it's not a question of not using those. We should be trying to get things down using them, but then you could go further with tree planting. It would also allow those most affected by land use change, and that's farmers, to have some control over the degree of land use change needed to manage climate change. Right now, they're suddenly waking up one morning to find the neighbour's sold and it's all going to be covered in pine trees. And it's coming from the industrial sector. This is a policy debate that is very much alive. And I'm just one contributor, but I'm firmly convinced that we will not make progress on a more sustainable approach to agriculture without joining up the policies that govern how we use our land and what we do with it. Joined up policies can do a better job than siloed ones. And that is the end of me reading a very dense piece with lots of clips. And I'd now be very happy to go back over any of that which is of interest. It's a bit hard to absorb in one go, but you need to put this all together. This is the problem. We've got so many siloized policies. We're not understanding the way they interact with one another. That's why I've been saying let's go back to base and rethink how we're doing this. So,
This podcast is brought to you by the IIEA, sharing ideas, shaping policy.